The security of property rights speaks to income mobility because it motivates efforts, it encourages innovation, and it fosters inventiveness.
Thank you for joining us for a new edition of the Perfectus podcast. My name is Gonzalo Schwarz, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Archbridge Institute, the home of Perfectus magazine. This podcast is part of a series of short conversations on the economics of human flourishing. At Archbridge, we define the economics of flourishing as the study of how markets, people, organizations, and institutions support the economic foundations of social mobility and human flourishing. And for this episode, I'm delighted to have three great guests to discuss how the rule of law and institutions support social mobility and increase human flourishing. So first, we'll have Dr. Justin Callais, who is our chief economist at the Archbridge Institute and an assistant professor of economics at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Second, we'll have Vincent Geloso, assistant professor at George Mason University, discussing the relationship between rule of law and institutions. And third, we have Vittorio Nastasi, director of criminal justice policy at the Reason Foundation, discussing their report that we've used for our social mobility index as well. So we're very thankful to Vittorio and Reason for their great work, and Vincent and Justin for their great scholarship. So Vincent, I wanted to start with you at first, and you can help us frame and set the stage about the importance of rule of law and strong institutions for social mobility and just for economic development more broadly, based on your work and your research in this area.
We have to understand that when we speak of rule of law, we are essentially talking about the security of property rights. And for us and developed countries where property rights are well protected relative to elsewhere, I wouldn't say they're as well protected as they could be. Cases like eminent domain legislation in the United States and civil asset forfeiture might be a bit worrying, but globally better than, say, the average country in the world. The security of property rights speaks to income mobility because it motivates efforts, it encourages innovation, and it fosters inventiveness. By doing all of these three, you are essentially boosting income mobility cross-generation, but also within generation. So big shocks to institutions, to the property of security, to the security of property rights during a generation or a cross-generation will allow people to seize more opportunities directly by their own effort or directly by trying themselves to do innovation, or by encouraging others to do innovation. It might actually seep on to people lower down the ladder, allowing them to climb. So I would argue that when we discuss income mobility, we deeply underappreciate the importance of the security of property rights for its promotion.
Thank you very much, Vincent. That was great. I think, and related to that, Justin, in our latest social mobility index at Archbridge, what are some of the main categories and indicators related to this broad topic of rule of law and institutions that we identified and measured across the 50 states that you think that we analyzed through research and through our work in this field to be some of the most relevant, and obviously some of the ones that there is data available, which is always a challenge to find data for all these indicators.
So we basically separated it into two subgroups within this area of institutions and the rule of law. So we looked at predatory state action, which is essentially in what ways do governments and government policies get in the way of people living their lives. And then we look at judicial system quality and say basically, all right, well, while we all in America, we have the idea of like equal access under the law, and equal opportunity under the rule of law in terms of what justice we actually can receive, there's ways in which states obviously differ in that, so we categorize those there. So for predatory state action, we look at things like fines and fees, which we will hear about in a little bit more, but it's basically the idea of how much revenue that local governments essentially extract that are separate from taxation and other areas. And then we look at corruption perception. It's the idea that basically corruption tends to benefit those at the top and hurt those at the bottom. So if we're going to expect to see some sort of disequal distribution, well, you're going to see that even more so in corrupt places. And we use that based on surveys from local reporters in different states. And we define, we look at legal corruption perceptions. So that's, sort of things that are technically legal and are not illegal by any stretch of the imagination, but are seen as basically things that can influence the political process in ways that are perhaps not ideal. So that could be things like, what are the political gains one can expect to have when they donate or lobby or have favors basically returned. While illegal corruption is basically just, when you think of corruption, you think of someone bringing a suitcase full of money, or like the senator from New Jersey with the gold bars hidden inside of his suit. So basically bribes and those sort of things, and kind of what is the perception of how corrupt in the actual illegal sense is there in the state. And then finally, in that predatory state action section, we look at civil asset forfeiture, which is by far one of the more egregious things that states in the U.S. have done in terms of basically taking people's property, right? That is a kind of direct measure of how freely states can essentially just steal people's property without much recourse. So for there, we basically look at how easy it is that, the state can actually take the money. So we look at things within there, like the standard of proof that basically the state has to show in order to take the money. Is it just, actual criminal activity, or is it just, oh, we suspect that this is probably criminal activity? This person was speeding, but they had $2,000 in cash on them. Why do they have $2,000 in cash on them? That seems sketchy. And they could just take the money because they probably, maybe they had a little bag of weed on them, and they're like, oh, well, they must be a drug dealer, so we could just take all their cash. What about the innocent until proven guilty burden, right? What's sort of that burden that, is it on those who were accused to prove that the money was not used, or that assets seized were not used for illegal activity? Or is it the state that's supposed to prove that? So what degree do states differ in that? And finally, the financial incentive. So how much can the police essentially keep in terms of the amount of money that they basically take in civil asset forfeiture? And that ranges widely across states, and it is quite striking. And then for judicial system quality, we look at access to justice. And generally the idea is states are scored on how states deal with the sort of equal justice under the law idea. Again, we have this general idea in the US and a lot of other countries about equal justice under the law, but how true is that actually across states? So it scores that there. And then we also have the state liability system quality. And that's, again, based on surveys that people have asked basically different in-house counsels, senior attorneys and litigators, as well as senior executives at companies in the area. And it looks at basically how they grade tort law in the country, in the state, some civil civil action lawsuits. How competent or trial judges, are they competent? Are they impartial? As well as jury fairness, right? Are juries kind of nudged in a way to favor one side or the other? So that's basically what we measure in this index, in these areas of the index. And I think it leads to some very interesting results that I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later.
Thanks, Justin. That is great. And that's, I think, great to set up, Vittorio, the work that you've done. And obviously, we were big fans of it, which is why we included it as one of the variables for the index, the work that Reason and you have done on fines and fees and the impact that could have in low-income communities and obviously on social mobility, which is what I wanted to ask you now. Obviously, it's complicated, difficult to summarize such a robust and I think great research in just a few minutes. But I was wondering if you can take us through what you found. What are the main negative consequences that fines and fees represent for everyday Americans? Maybe giving some examples of what those fines and fees are, just in layman terms, in a way. What are people facing day to day? And yeah, we can start with that first. What are the sort of the main negative consequences that you found in some of the examples of these fines and fees?
Yeah, so governments can charge or impose fines and fees for all kinds of conduct, be it criminal or even not necessarily criminal activities, but particularly at the local level, things like minor traffic violations or municipal code violations, things like if your grass is too tall or you have a cracked driveway. There are all kinds of ways in which governments can cite people and impose a penalty of a fine or a fee as people move through the court process or resolve any kind of municipal ordinance violation. And so in particular, at the local level, this can create a lot of bad incentives, especially in states that allow local governments to operate their own courts, because in those cases, you have a local government that's responsible for enforcement and also the court process. So municipal courts, would be government itself operating the court, employing the judge. And so there's no real separation between whatever the financial benefits of imposing fines might be for the local government and the administration of justice in that case. And so there can be, obviously a wide range of impacts, especially on low-income people when they encounter fines and fees. One is just obviously the direct financial impact of a fine or a fee, where typically fines and fees are not really scaled according to a person's economic standing. And so what might be a relatively small fine for most of us could end up being a fairly large financial impact on a lower income person or family. And that means that they don't have money to spend on other things like groceries or school supplies, that sort of stuff. And then there's also a lot of downstream consequences that can come from fines and fees. So if you fail to pay a traffic ticket, for example, your driver's license can be suspended. Many states allow driver's licenses to be suspended for failure to pay a fine or a fee, even if it's just the fact that the person can't afford to pay the fine. And so then if someone's driver's license is suspended, that impedes their ability to drive to work or to get to places where they need to go. A car is really essential to having it's in most places. And as a result, most people who have their driver's license suspended continue to drive. And if you're caught driving on a suspended license, that can come with substantially higher fees in the thousands of dollars and even incarceration. And so, what can be fairly minor enforcement of municipal ordinances or traffic laws can actually turn into a much larger problem from people, sucking them into the justice system and stacking on additional fines and fees.
Thank you, Vittorio. And from there, maybe if we step back a little bit, Vincent, that could also lead, I think, to a lot of corruption at the state level or the enforcers of this at different government levels, but just more broadly around negative consequences of just corruption more broadly. Sometimes we'd refer to it as cronyism or state capitalism or however we refer to it. How do you think that sort of broad topic affects, obviously, rule of law institutions, and how does that affect other areas? That could be entrepreneurship or just day-to-day lives if we have a corruption sort of being on top of us every day.
So on top of corruption and the additional everything that falls under the heading of the rule of law, I would point out that there is one concept regarding income mobility that is relative income mobility, which is we don't really care how much the average of the population increases. We care if a person is able, relative to his parents, to climb to a higher social standing position. So if I'm in the bottom 10% of the population when I'm born, so my parents are in the bottom 10%, can I climb to the top 10%? And everything that is related to the poor protection of property rights, to the protection of incumbent players on the market, either by legal fiat or by bribery, generates less relative income mobility, which is that what you're doing is essentially creating castes that are immutable over time. The virtue of a society governed by the rule of law that treats individuals as individuals, despite all the criticisms you could make of how much does the world look like the ideal, and we should always try to make it a bit more closer to the ideal. But the reality is that when you deviate from this ideal, the more you deviate, the more you create a caste-like society by making it impossible for people at the bottom to climb up, but also you're protecting people at the top from anything that would cause them to fall in status, not necessarily fall in living standard, like just fall in status so that they'd be overtaken by somebody who is poor but has a better idea. And I think we underestimate the importance of the rule of law in that sense. So, for example, Justin here in the podcast and I had made a paper where we checked two sets of things. Does society with more secure property rights have more relative income mobility across generation? And we found that, yes, they did. Societies that had much more secure property rights had more income mobility. But more than that, if you take other aspects of the degree of protection that is offered to individuals to their property, and by this I mean like regulations. Regulations are forms of violation of private property rights in that they limit what we can do with our businesses, with our houses, with our land, with our ideas. And the result of this is that when you tack on the role of regulation as an extra violation of property rights, you end up with actually even less income mobility. So institutional environments that secure property rights and regulate lightly are those that are able to generate a great deal of ability for people to rise from the bottom to the top, and for people at the top not to see their living standards fall, but just to not stay the top 1% forever, that they can recede towards the middle of the distribution so that status is not determined by birth. Societies that are less regulated and that have more secure property rights are societies that have a lesser and lesser importance of birth in determining where you end up later in your life relative to everybody else.
Thank you very much, Vincent. That's a great segue to the second part of the podcast that I wanted us to discuss more about solutions. So in this case, what you're recommending is that we have more secure property rights across societies that would lead to stronger institutions, stronger protections for people, and less regulation that in the end, when there is excessive regulation or more regulation, that just leads to more barriers for people to either operate a business, and that leads to then corruption. In many more developing countries, I think we see that leads to schemes of where you resort to either bribing public officials or you trying to circumvent regulations, and we don't address the root causes in terms of policy that we need to, that would help. Having less regulations would lead to more mobility in that sense.
I would say that, but I would add the following, is that it's not just a developing, because we think of property rights as being super well protected in Western societies. They are better protected than elsewhere, but it's not true that they are as well protected as they could be. Even within the United States, which is a high private property rights protected country in terms of the level of protections afforded, you can see massive differences across regions just with the regulation aspect that says, like, how much curtailments of your private property rights is there? And districts in the U.S., so inside data that have regional breakdown of income mobility, we find that the places that have lesser regulations tend to have higher level of relative income mobility across generations. Just to give you an idea, if we take, this is again a paper with Justin here, if you take the top 25 economically freest places in America, which means those with the least amount of regulations, enjoy, all else being equal, 7 to 12% more income mobility than the 25% of places that have the most regulation and the most infringement on private property rights. Even within countries with highly protected property rights, it matters. It matters to a great deal. 7 to 12% is not a negligible difference that we should want to secure. And we're not talking about major deregulation. There are not massive differences between a low regulated area in the US and a high regulated areas. So even small differences matter a lot, is the point I'm trying to convey. It's not just like it's Nigeria versus the United States. That's not correct. Property rights have even big effect, even at the top.
Thank you very much for that, Vincent. Complementing that, maybe Justin, you can, if you can go through what surprises you to find across states in terms of these findings, because I think we saw those same differences across U.S. states, and maybe what are the, in terms of solutions or policy levers that we can pull at the state level that we identify in the index? What are some of those that could improve social mobility at the state level when it comes to these specific categories or indicators?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think much like throughout the entire index, for example, I think especially what's true here is what probably stuck out to me the most is that this isn't the results here aren't a Republican or red or Democrat blue state issue, right? It's not like, oh, well, blue states do this well, red states don't, or vice versa. There's a wide mix of states that, that have pretty much nothing else in common other than the fact that they have really poor legal institutions. So, for example, New York, Illinois, and New Jersey are among the 10 worst in this area in terms of its access to justice and its predatory state action. But so is Arkansas, Georgia, Louisiana, and South Carolina, southern states that are typically considered red states. So I think from a broad perspective, what maybe not surprised me the most, but at least I think would be interesting to mention, is that this isn't just like a partisan divide. This isn't something that like, oh, these governors or these legislators are doing things really well. This philosophical or political reason is leading to all these better institutions. That just doesn't seem to be the case, according to what we find. I think when it comes down to actually policy levers, I would say the two that are the most tangible in terms of actually attacking and could provide the sort of highest benefits because the results are kind of so striking is from the fines and fees as well as the civil asset forfeiture. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, civil asset forfeiture is probably one of the most egregious predatory state actions that we see. And even states that do pretty well on judicial system quality, like Massachusetts, does not do super well on civil asset forfeiture. They actually score the worst grade of all the states, which is shocking considering the fact that most of the states, according to the Institute of Justice, receive a score, over half the states receive a score of D or worse. So Massachusetts stands out as receiving an F. That's because they have the lowest bar to forfeit. The government just has to show basically probable cause that the property was probably connected to a crime. So when it comes down to actually prosecuting them, right, you have to show beyond a reasonable doubt that they committed a crime. In order to actually take the assets, you just have to show like, oh, this was probably related to a crime. And then actually to get that, if you want to basically ask for that property back or, negotiate for that property back, there's very few protections for the innocent. It's very difficult, very costly and timely for people in Massachusetts and many other states to actually recover those seized property. And there's also a large profit incentive for police to use civil asset forfeiture in Massachusetts. Basically, up to 100% of forfeiture proceeds are going to go back to law enforcement. So there's a huge incentive from them that for whatever reason to basically take this money and take these assets and basically use whatever reason they have in order to actually take it. And this problem isn't going away, and it's probably getting worse over time, which I think is probably one of the more concerning parts. For example, going back to Massachusetts in 2000, they took about $8.5 million of assets from civil asset forfeiture. And in 2018, it was $36 million. So this number is growing, and not just in Massachusetts, but across most states. The dollar amount of assets taken is actually increasing over time. And when it comes to fines and fees, that differs widely across states, right? So the worst state, according to this report, was New York, which was basically taking $70 per person in fines and fees, while in a state, I believe it was Connecticut, it was just $2, which is, a huge difference, right? So, these are two things that aren't necessarily easily fixable, but at least things that would go in the very strong right direction in terms of, hey, we fully protect people's property in this state, and we fully, we as the government do our best to make sure that we are a provider, or at least do not get in the way of mobility rather than being the anchor that's holding them down.
Thank you very much, Justin. Specifically building on that, Vittorio, what do you think and what has your research shown in your report? As I said, it was very comprehensive in both the negative consequences and I think also in some best practices and solutions. What are some of the policies that policymakers, states, local institutions can adopt to improve their situation when it comes to fines and fees?
Yeah, so first let me say that, it's not the case that fines and fees are across the board a bad idea. In many cases, a fine is an appropriate sanction, especially for things like traffic violations, ordinance violations, and, some low-level misdemeanors. It would be much preferable to issue a citation with a fine than incarcerate somebody or put them on community supervision. So in many ways, fines are an appropriate and desirable sanction for conduct that violates the law or a regulation. At the same time, the concerns that we would have about the use of fines and fees relate to the incentives that governments might have to generate revenue through enforcement activities, and then the downstream consequences, things like driver's license suspensions, that would limit someone's mobility. And so, one approach is to address directly those downstream consequences. So about half of the states now have ended the practice of suspending driver's licenses for unpaid citations or court fees. And so that's one way to go about things. But another is to try to sever the fines and the revenue that they generate from the legitimate public safety interest of enforcement. And so one approach to doing that would be, as Alabama has done in the last couple of years, impose a cap on the share of a local government budget that can come from fines and fees. So now in Alabama, local governments can only collect up to 10% of their budgets from fines and fees, and any amount over that 10% threshold will be directed to state level funds. And so that way the local government can still engage in enforcement around traffic violations, again, in the interest of public safety. But there isn't necessarily a revenue motivation beyond that 10% of the municipality's budget. And so that's a very direct way in which a state can try to impose some limits on local governments trying to extract revenue through traffic citation. And another would be to just think about how jurisdiction is divvied up between different levels of government. So in a lot of cases, it may not make sense for a small town of 500 people to be responsible for enforcement on a state highway or the interstate system. There's really not a good reason why that local government needs to be responsible for that enforcement. Maybe it would make sense for county sheriffs or the state highway patrol to be engaging in that enforcement activity. And so, there's maybe some more ambiguous things like that cities could pursue.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Vittorio. We'll include in the comments of the podcast, we're including the report that Vittorio and his team did on fines and fees. We'll include the research that Vincent has mentioned, and certainly the social mobility index that Justin led at the Archbridge Institute. But for now, I just wanted to thank you all for your time. I think it was a great conversation. There's certainly a lot to get more specific and granular about a lot of these problems, and I hope that people will find those resources that we're going to share and contact all of the people on this podcast to find out more about all these issues and the importance that they have for, as we said, social mobility and just human flourishing more broadly. But for now, thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Perfectus podcast. It's been a pleasure to dive into the fascinating world of the economics of human flourishing with our esteemed guests. As we continue this series, we look forward to exploring more about how markets and institutions not only support, but also enhance our social mobility and overall well-being. Remember to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform so you don't miss an episode. And for more insights, be sure to visit us at the Archbridge Institute and check out Perfectus magazine. We're excited to bring you more conversations that bridge the gap between economics and the pursuit of human flourishing. Thank you once again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.